For the third drum in our Snare Spotlight series, I thought I'd bring in one of mine. The last two we borrowed from other players, and this is one of my favorites that I've had for a long time. It is a black iron Keplinger snare, 6 inches deep, 14 inches diameter, and 8 lugs. I lived in Seattle for about 10 years, and I came to be friends with Gregg Keplinger while I was there. And for those of you who don't know who that is, he is sort of famous for being both a drum builder and percussion builder, and he is also a tech and a tuner for a lot of famous grunge artists. You can definitely hear the sound of his drums on Soundgarden records, even things like Sunny Day Real Estate and Pearl Jam and a lot of huge artists from that era. And he still does that even now. Toward the end of the 90s, I think he moved harder into building drums on his own. And initially he was making shells kind of quietly all the way back since the 70s, and he made them for AOT for a little while, and some of you may have seen the wood hoop AOT Keplinger snares. They are fantastic instruments. They are another kind of heavy metal snare drum, and they are also incredibly versatile because of the methods that he uses to make them, and they can be extremely customizable because he does build them to order in addition to the ones that are a set instrument. Pretty much all of us have seen things that resemble this, and Gregg is the originator of this style of sort of loose Ching Ring, and this is one of his. And you can tell if it's an original because it is signed on the back permanently with a Dremel tool. More recently, he's branched out into larger things like this, which you can set on your snare drum for a variety of applications. And these are easy to find. For instance, at Revival Drum Shop, they sell them online, and there are a few other places that they can be found. So first things first, there's been a lot of debate about the terminology around drum shells online recently. And just to quickly say up front, this shell is not made of iron. It's a shell that has not been buffed. It's the raw finish from when it came into being as a flat sheet. So it still sometimes has text markings and different things on it, little imperfections and rust and stuff like that. And it does actually have a dramatically different sound than the polished stainless shells that he's originally known for. He also does brass, and he used to do copper sometimes. I went with the black iron because of some characteristics that he described to me about the sound, and I found those to be true. And I also asked him about what his thoughts were for the most versatile drum that he could make for me in terms of lug count and depth and diameter and all of those things, which resulted in the drum that you see here. He does the bearing edges by hand. The shell is an 1/8 inch thick, and so you get sort of a sharp edge coming in. It's not like a Ludwig snare, like a Superphonic, but it is also not sharp. So there are a lot of overtones, but they are also fairly controlled because of the thickness of the shell and that kind of profile on the bearing edge. When I spoke to Gregg about building me a drum, I wanted something that was on the brighter end of the spectrum, but not overly so, because I did have drums already that were metal and that were fairly loud, but I wanted something that could cut live where I didn't have to play quite so hard to feel really present on stage, but that also had enough character and kind of depth to it to be fun to play and be versatile. So that resulted in me doing black iron rather than brass, which was, to my ear, significantly darker based on the drums that I had played. This also brought me to do 8 lugs instead of 10, and the conversation that I had basically boiled down to, with a 10 lug drum, you're hearing the head a little bit more and the shell a little bit less. And with an 8 lug snare, you're hearing a little bit more of the character of the shell because there are less nodes and because there's just generally less pressure on the head at a given tension. There's a little more resonance to the shell. So if you're going to go out of your way to get a drum that has a special material in the shell, sometimes even for a 14-inch drum, 8 lugs is the way to go. Likewise, with a very loud metal drum, having a little more physical depth is nice because it'll make sure that you don't go into the realm of it really only just sounding like a gunshot. You want to also be able to have a deeper sound or a warmer sound and a fatter sound. So a 6-inch deep drum is kind of a nice middle ground, and one that Gregg has made the most of, he said to me. Now, this drum recently became equipped with some custom-made black iron stainless hoops that Gregg made for me as well. But since we're talking about normal snare sound behaviors and things like that in these videos, I went back to the triple flange for it, but you can see those hoops in an upcoming series we're going to do about snare hoops. and the way that wood works, the way that triple flange, no flange with claws, a die cast, different kinds of die cast. We're going to go into all of that, do sound comparisons, structural comparisons, and all of those things. For me, this is the snare I have that's probably been recorded the most, and that is really just because it has a huge tuning range. It doesn't choke no matter how hard you hit it. And it also seems to fit in the mix in a way where people notice that it sounds good, but it also isn't distracting ever. And it's worked in small rooms, big rooms, everything in between. And generally, apart from the fact that it's heavy to carry around, it probably gets more use than any of the rest of my drums. It is heavy though. It's not bell brass or bell bronze heavy, but it definitely is close to 20 pounds. And if you put die cast on it, it gets even heavier. So it tends to be used mostly for recording, or if I'm on the road and we're driving. Walking around the city with something like this is not a picnic at all. So let's talk about the sound of this drum now. Basically, this is the sound of a rock snare writ large, as far as I'm concerned. But it is a little more aggressive than a Ludwig drum with rolled over edges, and it also is a lot louder than something in the superphonic realm at the same kind of intensity of stroke. And that's lovely for if you have to play a really long show and you don't want to bash the whole time and still be really present on stage. And likewise, in a recording scenario, you don't have to necessarily trot out the 2Bs to have a really aggressive sound. You can kind of dial it back and still be super punchy, and make sure that the snare is present in the overheads and in the room mics, rather than it just being cymbals everywhere. Today, the drum is coming from my house with the same heads that have been on it for a little while. They are on the way to getting worn out, but still totally usable. And I thought it might actually be nice to hear what it sounds like after it's been gigged and these heads have been broken in a little bit. And sort of the way that you might find one of these if you go to a recording studio, which is the first place where I saw one. Lots of studios actually own drums like this for artists to use when they come in for sort of special occasions and things like that. We also received a request to play a little more in these videos, so I'm going to do some single hits, and I'm also just going to kind of improvise a little bit on the drum to help people get a feel for what it does in context. It's a pretty aggressive drum, but it's also very, very sensitive. And because of the 8 lugs, the whole character of the drum is a little bit darker than a 10 lug drum. And I know that not just because of the physics, but also because when I was interested in getting one of these, I played a 10 lug, I played an 8 lug, and I also played some that were deeper and that were shallower. And in general, I found that the 8 lug version had a fatter sound at every tuning and was maybe a little less precise at, super sharp stuff at a given tuning. But I wasn't terribly concerned with that. I wasn't thinking about using this for orchestral music or something like that. I wanted it to be big and present on stage when you're pounding out 2 and 4, and also be articulate enough for when you want to play little fiddly stuff and have it make it to the audience and not get lost in the mix on stage. One thing that Gregg seemed to care a lot about when he was describing these drums to me was narrow snare wires. He really loves 16-strand or even 12-strand wires on a 14-inch drum for rock music. And his thinking was, you don't want to stifle the resonance of the drum because that's a tone thing. You want that tone to come out. And I think he's right about that. I still like a little more snare sound than that. So right now I have 20-strand wires on here. And that definitely gives me more than enough, and I probably wouldn't go wider than that. I tried 24s once, and the drum itself was almost like too powerful for that. It was hard to get articulation because it was moving so much air. One thing that I also really love about Gregg's drums, and Ben actually brought this up earlier today when we were talking, is that there's no badge on them at all. There's no kind of design business on it. It's a very utilitarian design, very brutish. And what Gregg does to sort of delineate his drums from everything else instead is he signs the inside again with the Dremel tool, he dates it, and he has a stamp that says "not fragile" on it, which he stamps the inside of every drum with, which I just love because they really aren't. They are super tough. They're built like a tank, and as sort of odd of a drum as it is, I feel like I could do just about anything I could imagine with this drum. And that was proved to me when I saw some photos of Kenny Washington, the famous bebop drummer from New York who still lives here, who got a Keplinger drum from Gregg directly on tour in the 70s. And he's used it, according to him, for virtually every gig since then. And at that time, I think Gregg's shells were slightly thicker, and Kenny said that it was the only drum he ever played that sounded good in every room, every time, and that the only drag was it was just a pain to schlep around the city. Which, I mean, if it's good enough for him and Matt Cameron, it's good enough for me.